Right.
So,
I
for
had
those
never
of
seen that on the
you-
big screen because of the pandemic.
Yeah, that was actually the big screen premiere of Oink. It premiered at a couple of festivals, but they had to all be online. For those of you who maybe joined us during the films or who didn't catch the introduction, we just looked at two pieces of video art and then one documentary short. The two pieces of video art were by Liz Rosenfeld, who's sitting here to my left. The first was called Heart from 2003, and the second was called Tremble from 2020. And then we watched a documentary short that was produced by Joao and a collaboration between Joao, Liz, the music by Liam Byrne, and Rufai Ajala and Rob Eagle also collaborated on that film, and that was from 2020 and was based on research from Joao's book. And so just to start, I know that both of you talked a little bit, I think, about the films before it started, but sometimes it's helpful to hear a couple of words, I think, after we've seen something. So we can just go through each one, but starting from Heart. If you could talk a bit about the movie, and I know this is a question you've asked me privately, so I don't know if you have the answer to it, but maybe you could reflect on it a little bit. Why do you think 15 years on, faggots really want to see that film?
Some faggots at least.
I mean,
Yeah.
you two seem, you two too. I don't, it's interesting because this film somehow in the last few years has really had some kind of like, it kind of started with you a while ago, but it's been really re-embraced. And it's a film that I haven't really engaged with since I made it, actually. So, I don't know is the answer. I mean, that film in particular, it's like, I just feel a lot of, like, kind of, you know, I'm sort of like overwhelmed with like, when I see it, just because it's like looking back at a very specific time in one's life, where, you know, it was really just like an exploration, beginning of an exploration of queerness for me that I was just trying to articulate for myself, and through different, you know, modalities, I was exploring that. Why do you think?
I don't know.
Well,
I mean,
I think it was really ahead of its time. I think it's like I think it opens up so many conversations that I feel like we're only maybe now having correctly for the first time. What were the reactions of people when you were making that and other films? Because this is when you were getting your MFA, I believe,
Yeah.
and this is a queer scene or a gay sex scene in, I believe, Chicago that may have been less ready for.
Sure. I mean, the reactions that I got were pretty kind of volatile, actually, when I first showed this film, mostly from cis gay men, all from cis gay men, actually, accusing me of having stolen this like cultural sacred experience, and that there's no way I could have known what it was like inside a, like, you know, gay bathhouse, and where did I get this narrative from? I couldn't have possibly like written or fantasized or thought about it for myself. So there was a lot of like anger about it, and I didn't really know how to react to that because, particularly when I was, you know, a young art student, you know, that's what, and still today, our artistic process is about, is exploring the questions that we have, at least for me, exploring the questions that I have about myself and my journey and the stories that I want to tell and also understand. So in a way, as painful as it is to kind of like revisit that film, it's also kind of like an artifact of, for me, of this like trajectory of, you know, making work, also like my own queer exploration. I mean, for me, it's part of my story. So, yeah, it's
also like super hot.
I'm glad you think so.
I mean, you know, like when I first saw it, you know, as a fag, you know, with a card. I've got the fag card. But as a fag, I was always, what the fuck? Like, this is really turning me on quite heavily. And I show it to my undergraduate students, and I mean, they're like 20-year-olds now, right? Or like 19, 20-year-olds now, and they still get like totally gobsmacked, you know, how is this voice that is not the voice of like a man, like embodying this space and embodying this experience of like faggotry, and like this, and I think that's fucking amazing. You know, it's such a kind of a beautiful thing if, you know, it's there, you know, take it. Do you want to be a fag? You know, like embody this space, you know, it doesn't belong to anyone, to be honest.
I think at that point too, like most of my kind of like visual knowledge or narrative knowledge of, you know, like of like fag culture, gay male culture, specifically cis gay male culture, I should say, really came from like gay porn and then, you know, terrible TV. and to me it was really like, why is this kind of like liberatory narrative only being applied to like cis gay male bodies when I feel like very much like, you know, of that, akin to that, desiring that, you know, not that I was necessarily like, I want to go cruising and only like, you know, find like cis male bodies in a cruising space, but it was where I had, you know, that's where I was starting essentially, because that was the you know, entrance into this narrative that I had access to. It was also, you know, there was no binary or like discourse of like non-binary. There was no discourse around the concept of like non-binary, even like the concept of no gender. I mean, of course it existed. It just, there wasn't like language around it. There was still a very, very binary kind of choice within a like, at least within the queer and gender queer, you know, scene that I was arriving in and coming up in, which was like mostly like skinny white drag kings who all looked like Justin Timberlake, right? And I just like couldn't pass in that scene either. So I think this was like the beginning of me asking those questions for sure.
Well, and then to move to the second film, Tremble. I remember how excited you were when you went to make it, and I remember how urgent it felt to you to make that film right at that moment. We have two films that were made right at the beginning of or during the sort of first pandemic lockdown. Why do you think it felt so urgent for you right in that moment to kind of get into that kind of space and to make work in and about that space?
Well, certainly, I'm sure as many in this audience, or I'm not going to assume, but could possibly identify with, as soon as we went into this like extreme lockdown state, there was this question of, well, like, what is the future of, you know, queer sex, queer public sex, queer polyamorous sex, polyamorous, or just in general, like, like queer sexual relationality outside of like, you know, a kind of homo normie, whatever, you know, your one partner in life. Like, what's going to happen to cruising? What's going to happen to our spaces? And particularly as a queer person who really like relies on that as a big part of my life and my narrative, queer sex space. I guess I was really curious to go into, you know, a dark room that was supposedly like unused. Let's say it had been unused since we had gone into lockdown at that point. But it really just felt like, it kind of felt like the scene of a crime, like everyone had to leave really fast. And it was like, you know, there was like, it really felt like everyone had to like just exit. And that was really interesting to me, to go back to this kind of like ephemera, like all the dried cum on the walls, the like disgustingness of the dark room, and also to be in there with the lights on, which I had never done before, was a big part of it too. And just to kind of like, I don't know, I was interested in what was resonating in that space and that architecture, and also as a crew of queer people who were not cisgendered gay men, who were helping me to make that film, like, and who all also have like stories of fucking and passing or getting thrown out of that particular dark room in our own Berlin narratives, all of which I've had, you know. I wanted to spend time in there and also just think about like historical resonance, energy resonance, and also like what will this become? Will it ever go back? Of course it will in some way, but like how and when and what, what is the potential of this space?
Mm-hmm.
What is it as a kind of threshold in this moment of like a space that's, that's like energized by like sexual resonance, but like technically not in use for a long period of time.
Yeah,
it
that
does
makes
feel quite
sense.
melancholic.
Yeah.
No.
And Joao, this one's more for you. And these questions of exclusion and inclusion in that place, I want to get back to that soon. But first, just to make sure that we cover each of the films to start, could you talk a little bit about Oink, about the takeaways from the book or from your research that you thought were important to get into the film? Or don't answer that question, and maybe instead talk about the film. Talk about the film.
answer that
Or you could
question.
also talk about the filmmaking process,
Yeah, I
who
mean,
the
I think-
voices are, who the interviewees
Yeah.
are, what are these voices that we're hearing? What are we seeing? How is this put together? What is the story that we're being told?
So I think with the film, what I did not want to do from the start, I did not want to make a film that was like a kind of a. I didn't want to ask people, can you please illustrate my book? I didn't want that. I wanted it to be something different that stood on its own feet and had a different kind of angle from which it was kind of approaching a particular kind of sex culture. That was not, the academic way or whatever way I used in the book. So I wanted the crew to just come at it from where they were, and I wanted also the guys in the film to just. I want to create a space where they could just like talk openly about whatever they wanted. So obviously, two of the people, which is the only two people you see on the screen, were shot in Berlin during the pandemic. The American accents, and this was because of the pandemic, because obviously we couldn't interview and film as many people as we wanted in Berlin. The actual, just the audio, disembodied voices are from people that I interviewed for the book. So in who are them?
LA, right?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if it was just both of them in LA. So the kind of American voices are in LA. Yeah, I mean, and I think actually both with the film and the book, I have like hours and hours of chatting recorded. Not everything made it to the film, but it was really. I didn't come with any like set questions. I came in and just had a chat. Yeah, and I think what I wanted, one was that they could feel comfortable talking. I was especially interested in issues of care, in issues of how do you relate to masculinity, what are the kind of practices of care and ethics that exist or don't exist in these spaces, but those were kind of vague kind of ideas. And then what I also didn't want the film to do, and that's I think one of the only things I told Liz and the crew, was that I didn't want the film to come across as like a bird's eye view, or like give a sense of like this is what pigs are, but I wanted it to be just a kind of a snapshot of these people in this moment, rather than wanting to make a kind of a statement about it. So not to kind of, on the one hand, not to kind of objectify them that much, or also not to kind of come up with some kind of general statement about something that is very much living. And just one last thing, I also didn't want any talking heads, because I don't like talking heads. Yeah. Is that the answer?
Yeah. It's an answer. Just so you know, we have enough to talk about up here for the next 20 minutes or so without any questions from the audience, but we would welcome questions. So I'm going to ask something now, and then between each question, I'll open it up so you can start thinking if you have something to ask, or you can just be drunk and chill and listen to us talk instead. That's fine. But I wanted to ask, you mentioned briefly, Liz, in your answer about why Tremble felt important to make in the moment that it did. You kind of referenced Ficken and the ways in which Ficken is a very potentially complicated space, And I think a lot of people here, I'm judging by the few that I know and also cite, may have some experience with it. It's a space that I think is known in queer somehow, and not just cis-gay communities. And it's a space that's important in them, but it's also a space that in its darkroom very explicitly excludes. It's a space that's been called out for that. It's a space where that exclusion has been a really kind of active, often a really active topic of conversation around who organizes things there and who doesn't. And I think that opens up a question that might connect all three of these films, and then also some of the things we were talking about earlier, and also the Castles installation as well. How open can and should these kinds of spaces be? To what kinds of bodies can and should they be open? What are the benefits of inclusion? I think we're operating here in this conversation from a place of advocating for and fighting for and believing in inclusion as an active and important process. What are the limits of inclusion? And how, like, what are ways that inclusion can work or cannot work? I'm also thinking about that moment in Oink when the American narrator is talking about really being into lesbian porn and these kinds of inclusion that cut across in different ways. It's a big question. But
I think that the concept of inclusion, in the same way that the concept of safe space, I think it doesn't exist. I mean, I don't think humans are inclusive by nature. I think they're exclusive by nature, and in fact, really search for spaces of exclusion. But I would even more say like spaces of separatism. And I'm not speaking against that, quote unquote, so to speak, because I mean, there are many spaces of separatism that are about deep hatred and violence. That's certainly also not what I'm speaking to right now, but I also think that we need to be real about this concept of inclusion. And even with I think it becomes representational, and it becomes part of representational politics. And specifically with Ficken as a space, I've had all kinds of experiences there. Like, Ficken used to have all-inclusive darkroom nights where anyone could go cruising down there. And, sometimes it was the case, but most of the time it was not. And there were many times where I was heckled out of the dark room or asked what I was expecting to find there by, assuming male identified people who read me as not a cis gay man. Mm-hmm. But then also on non-explicitly queer marked nights, I've completely had great times where, to a point where one guy, I was in a threesome with two people I came with, and one guy whispered in my ear, "This should happen here more often. Why doesn't this happen here more often?" And so I think it's really about, embracing this kind of root of hypocritical desire that I think is really at the fundamental base of what queerness is that we're all battling this or I don't know if battling is the right word, but we're all kind of making sense of desire in all of these ways in our lives, particularly as queer people. And a lot of that is rooted in a kind of in conflicting desires, particularly when it comes to political desire, and then a desire for what we actually want to experience. And that's something that, always sort of bugged me and baffled me, that conversation is still quite hard to have in queer spaces, which I often find, which many people do. And I'm not saying explicitly lesbian identified or gay identified or trans identified, but queer identified spaces I can also feel equally as kind of isolated and anxious in as anywhere else. And so I'm really interested in this kind of idea of that the hypocritical desire is kind of at the root of our impetus and our need and our desire narratives as queers.
Mm-hmm. It's really difficult to reconcile that something you desire, some kind of sex you want to have, may actually be you may see it as at odds with your own politics, right? And the inability to actually stay with that
Sure.
feeling, right? And use it as a way to actually kind of reflect on, rather than pushing it to the side, or like not acknowledging that sometimes we desire things that are a bit fucked up in the ways that we then think politically.
And then I
right?
think on top of that, like what's also really important to recognize in that is then like where the like privilege and the question of privilege and access comes in when it comes to like race, class, and gender, right? Like, okay, sure, we can talk about, like the things that we desire that we're not supposed to like actually come in contact with, but then alternatively, it's definitely more kind of like acceptable within a like cis gay male space, I would say, to desire to, or I don't know, this is just my particular experience, to like enact desire that potentially, like from what I've experienced when I walk in, suddenly, even if I'm like, in my mind, if I'm read as something other than cis male, I'm automatically gendering a space. I'm automatically defining a space that was otherwise just about men. And also, it's for me, I even hear myself talk about this and I'm like, God, we're still having these conversations. Like, 15 years after I made this film, I'm still having this conversation. So like, what is that, right?
Yeah, there's this, there's a great question posed by the trans theorist Andrea Long Chu, who's, I don't know if she's ever going to finish this project, but at one point she was working on a project, the research question of which is what happens when marginalized people do not dedicate themselves to political work that we think is righteous, but do something else instead. And what do we do with that, and what do we think about that? And she has a great, she describes trying to make your desire conform to your politics as like trying to give a cat a bath. Before we go on for any longer, I want to see if there are questions or perspectives from the audience. I'll invite you to raise your hand, and then I'll just repeat what you say so that we get it on the film. If not, then I'll ask about something that I think comes up in all of these films, but the great summary of it, I think, is that line near the end of Oink that gets me every time, where the narrator is saying something about, I'm going to ruin it, but something about this moment when suddenly you realize that what you're doing is having sex with the night. It's not a specific thing. It's like, it's the night, it's the experience. And there's something there, I think, about sublimating the self to something bigger, whether it's the going from the substance of the body and the heartbeat to this imagined world. I think you see it also in Tremble with the breath and the trembling that's there in the title. This idea of transformation that we saw in Castle's work, some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier with substances and sort of technologies of the self. What do both of you maybe think is queer about that, and why do we want it, and what are its potentials, and what are its potential dangers? Very small, easy, simple question, but...
I mean, to me, what I like about it is this kind of the potential of what may come when you get outside of yourself, as in this kind of dissolution of the ego, if you want, or like, and I think that's what I hear in that is the sense that it's not just about him and whoever he's fucking. It's a kind of a total different like sense of being and of relating to. So it's not just about individuals. It's something that is kind of broader, and it's something that, I mean, for some reason that if you're kind of psychoanalyst and you're Lacanian, you talk about kind of orgasm as this kind of like experience of like self-annihilation or like jouissance or whatever, right? That you kind of undo yourself, and maybe that's also related to the experience of drugs or whatever. I think to me, especially in a moment where we seem to be so kind of protective and self-assured, or at least we pretend to be so self-assured about who we are and our identities, and everything is so close to us. I think that potential of like melting, to me is quite politically interesting, as what can come after that, and that's what I read into that thing. But I also wonder, why did you edit that quote at the end of the film? Because you did put it there, I didn't.
Well, I mean, out of all the kind of protagonists of that film, I think I really fell in love with that one the most. Also, that voice was like just a voice. It wasn't an image to me too. And I really was trying to create a dark room that never existed in the filming of that film through the editing, which was like really exciting for me to do with such, I mean, really we had, because of the restrictive production, we made a film from really not much.
No.
Really not much at all.
I think we shot for like 4 days.
I think, yeah, and we had to think fast about what we were going to do with it, which, I love limitations, and I'm an experimental artist, and, so for me it was like exciting to go into that and really think about, okay, what can we do with really not much? And I don't want this to just be like another like gay fetish film that's gonna play at every fucking queer film festival. Like, I don't give a shit, honestly. Like, for me, the reason I wanted to do this film was because of my relationship to you and to our to like our connection over the years, and how we found each other, and the thing, and like our ongoing discourse about bodies and sexuality and plasticity and possibility, and also personally just kind of like my lifelong like struggle and kind of like deep personal research and love with so many like gay academics, actually, particularly like cis gay male academics who I somehow have found myself in very intense different kinds of relationships to. But you were somebody that I felt also like, I feel like we really see each other, and that was really what was, and I read your book, which really like moved me deeply, and there was so much of you in that book, which is why I was interested in making, honestly, I mean, I'm all for pig sex, I'm all for people like great, like live, but I don't really need to see another film about like gay men and fetish culture. Like, I didn't want to make another one of those films, basically. And that was the goal. One of the other goals was, you didn't write another book by another academic, dealing with like, in a post like, AIDS PrEP world. You really tried to open that up into like, okay, well, what is this proposed for us now as queer people, and not just as like cis gay men, or not just as a cis gay man? What does this actually open up in the potentiality of queer bodies? And for me, that was like a very new way of approaching all of these topics. So that was my investment in the film. And I guess ending with that very beautiful poetic quote was also about opening up what you propose, like even like PrEP opens up beyond cis gay male sex, like which for me was like huge to think about this question as a queer sexuality. So I guess in a way that's also what I was thinking about when ending that. It was like, let's open this up. Like, you're opening yourself up to the night. You're not opening yourself up to like one specific kind of encounter or one specific kind of body, or, or like what you should be attracted to or desiring because you are passing or codified in a certain way in this space.
Before I go on, I want to see if there are any questions or comments from the crowd.
We also need to like linger for long. I'm not saying this because I want to go to the toilet and have a...
Anyway, I was going to ask about staging the self and how it comes up in all of the films. And again, I'm going to use an example from Oink to illustrate the question, because I think Oink was A, the last one we saw, and B, it's less abstract than the other two, certainly. The other moment in Oink that always kind of strikes me is right at the beginning, when we have this kind of monologue about authenticity in fetish photography, and these sort of two people are laughing and talking about the how the attraction, one of the narrators is talking about the attraction of fetish photography as opposed to, and portraiture as being somehow capturing this really kind of authentic moment, this authentic desire. And then at the same time, we're watching one of the most obviously staged and multiplied and non-authentic quote-unquote images we could see. The screen is doubled. Each one of those doubled images has multiple overlays on it. I mean, it's really kind of an attack on the idea that the authentic or the unmediated self even exists. There's something kind of queer about that, I think, and I wanted to ask both of you to reflect on it, on this kind of staging of the self and on the failure of authenticity.
To me, maybe I'll just say something quickly, because to me, I read that actually through these, I think it speaks really nicely to conversations on pornography and like kind of ongoing cultural panic around pornography, and which is this idea, you know, is porn a documentary, right? Is porn really giving you the truth about the thing that you are watching, or is porn actually kind of a highly staged, mediated, and like artificial thing that actually produces that effect of authenticity? And that's what I kind of read in that moment where, you know, when they're talking about the authenticity of fetish photography, but then towards the end of that sequence, it's so fun when one of the seven says, it's so funny because what you see and what's happening in real life are completely different things. And that to me always kind of goes back to, actually is a great comment on porn and on any kind of mediated sex that you see. You know, what you see and what's happening in real life are completely different things. And that again brings me to that independent queer porn studio in the UK, 4 Chambers, that I'm obsessed with, and they always have films at the Berlin Porn Film Festival. And after the credits of every single film they do, they show like kind of just shots from where they were filming, and it's fucking hilarious. You know, they're laughing, they're taking the piss, you know, they are telling jokes, they're kind of looking after one another. And that kind of balance between, you know, this is what's happening behind, and letting people know this is what's happening behind, even if, you know, the sex that you are seeing is really kind of rough or looks
constructed.
Yeah, it's highly constructed, and that kind of, which then you can also bring back to like sex itself. You know, like you can have really hard sex, but you know, it's fucking theater. You're kind of playing. I mean, all the fucking queens in the cocktail dark room, you know, they're all like kind of dancing and prancing around on the dance floor, and as soon as they hit the dark room, their fucking voice drops by an octave, and they go like, whoa, and then they come out, come on girl, let's have a drink. You know, this kind of sense of like theater, it's fucking drag, you know, and I think it's really important to highlight that, not as like it's bad because it's fake, but we're all performing for one another, right? Anyway, I'll shut up.
I mean, I think you said it pretty well about authenticity. What is authenticity really when it comes to any kind of like subcultural experience? You know, we're all being informed by, particularly when it comes to like porn and fetish, we're being informed by like imagery and systems and histories that have been informing us for, you know, our whole lives. So we're just kind of like we're just making our own kind of subjectivities, or, you know, becoming, undoing, etc., our own subjectivities based on this kind of very highly codified, you know, knowledge and imagery and history. But it's also, like, who cares kind of about authenticity, I feel like. You know what I mean? Because it's...
And that's the other moment another one of the things that I like about, another moment in Oink that I really like is that, that moment when we hear the piano music and the narrator is talking about these sort of intrusive thoughts in the darkroom. It's like, I know I'm not supposed to be thinking this, and yet I am. And yet all of us know, I think, that oftentimes that's what you're thinking about the most. Like that's the majority of the experience of the whole thing is these intrusive thoughts of these things that are not somehow part of your construction of the experience, that are somehow taking you out of it. And maybe it's those that... Maybe it's those where the potential is, those moments of confusion or of being dragged out of the self or of being jostled or...
of going off script, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When scripts break.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unless we have
I
further
think
questions or ideas from the audience, I think
we'll
we
wrap
can
it up.
wrap it up. And thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you
And
for staying
thank
over.
Giovanni and Giacomo for inviting us. And Tim and Pascal on the technical desk are very wonderful. Thank you also to Draußenstadt and the Berlin Senate, Daddy Senate, for funding us, and the Club Commission as well. And we'll be back tomorrow night. We may see some of you. Tickets will be available. I think tickets are still available for tomorrow night. Please come join
Blood
us. And
Sisters is super hot.
it's so good.
I mean,
amazing.
it's amazing. I really, if you can come and see this tomorrow night, it is a really fantastic, sexy, amazing historical film. Yeah.
And if it rains, we'll all sort of cuddle under the tent and watch a movie. It'll be fun like camping. So see you tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you.